think that many people know that Native Americans have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And with the pandemic, that there are changes in how people are voting, and that presents additional challenges for Native American voters. But of course, this election is so important that tribes and communities are trying to do their best to adjust to the pandemic so that people were able to exercise their right to vote.
Talk about some of those challenges, not just in a time of pandemic, but just in general.
Yeah, I mean, just in general, Native Americans in Arizona have unequal access to early voting, voter registration, language translations, and they have to travel long distances to register to vote and participate in in-person early voting. And vote by mail is not a simple or easy task for many Native Americans living on reservations, because only 18% of Native Americans in the state of Arizona receive mail at their home. They don't have standard addresses, which definitely impacts them on both the voter registration end, but then also in voting on election day.
I was going to say, it also, isn't it somewhat unclear on some of these tribal lands where the voting precincts are? You could drive 2 and 3 hours and go to the wrong place.
Yeah, so the voting precincts have been established by the counties, and not all tribes actually have polling locations on their reservations. A large number do, but then those individuals need to determine where is their polling location and how will I get there.
Yeah, and you just mentioned it. It's not just voting, it's registration as well.
Yeah, that's right. So voter registration normally in Native American communities is done in person on the ground. And obviously with the pandemic, that's been challenging. Until September 4th, if you lived on a reservation, you weren't able to use the online voter registration system because it didn't accept non-traditional addresses. So that put Native American people at a disadvantage if they were trying to register to vote.
And you talk about online registration. That's if you have internet access.
Yes, of course. And Native Americans in Arizona don't have sufficient broadband access, and we can see that they don't have this access. So already access to broadband is a challenge for voter registration.
So, I mean, are there things like drive-through registration going on? Is there something that's happening that can help get folks registered and get folks to vote?
Yes, a number of tribes were actually conducting drive-through voter registrations along with their census drives, which is also very important and impacts voting. And some of the counties, the northern Arizona counties, were conducting some drive-through voter registrations.
And everything we're talking about here, I would have to think it adds to a sense of simply being disenfranchised. It has to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, Native Americans are at a disadvantage. It's not a simple or easy task just to register to vote or turn out to vote on election day. Many Native Americans don't have access to cars. There's no public transportation systems on the reservations. So people who are going to vote are really committed to voting. And so, you know, there are a lot of additional issues just with regard to lack of trust in government and the services that are provided on the reservation that we can see through this pandemic, where Native Americans are disproportionately impacted.
And I was going to ask about the pandemic. Talk about ways in which what is already a difficult situation is made worse by COVID-19.
Yeah, definitely. It's harder to participate in voting because they're limiting the number of people who can be at the polls, but we want to make sure that people are safe, but they also have access to voting. And so having more in-person early voting would help to reduce the spread. Some counties are doing that, some are not. They have many Native Americans on the Navajo and Apache reservations who require language translation, and that can only be done in person. And because Native Americans don't have reliable access to mail, they really can't participate at the same level in vote by mail. So those are challenges.
So it sounds to me, and we talked about being disenfranchised here, it sounds like Native Americans, the Native American vote is kind of being left out in all of this talk of mail-in ballots and fraud and the whole 9 yards. It seems like that's almost on a different track.
So for example, the state of Arizona, the legislature passed the ballot collection law, and that case is going to be heard by the US Supreme Court. But the Ninth Circuit found that the ballot collection law disproportionately impacted Native Americans, Hispanics, and African Americans, and it not only had a discriminatory impact, but it was passed with discriminatory intent. And I think a lot of times the people who are making laws may not be thinking about how these disadvantages impact Native American voters. I would hope to think they aren't thinking about that when they're passing these laws that do disproportionately impact them.
And last point here, the goal here is to, in some way, build faith in the democratic process.
That's right. There was a study done by the Native American Voting Rights Coalition that found that there's a lack of trust in government by Native American people. And there's a lot of historical memory with regards to disenfranchisement and discrimination. And so the goal is that people feel like they're part of the system and that they have a voice and that they'll want to turn out and continue to participate.
All right. Well, Patty, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. You have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
And that is it for now. I'm Ted Simons. Thank you so much for joining us. You have a great evening. Coming up on Cronkite News, a look at political advertising and how much is being spent to swing voters in Arizona. And later, breaking down relationships between white and black women.
A wave of political spending has hit Arizona this year, with advertising totals smashing records unlike the state has ever seen. But who's spending the big bucks, and what does that mean for the state as a whole?
Plus, Project Search, how COVID-19 affected a transition program for adults with disabilities who are trying to get a job.
And later in this half hour, a look at why white and black women have difficulties being allies.
Cronkite News starts now.
Good evening and welcome to Cronkite News on Arizona PBS. I'm Megan Marples.
And I'm Spencer Hardenberg. Thank you for joining us.
The country is continuing to move in the wrong direction when it comes to the pandemic, adding nearly 67,000 new coronavirus cases on Monday and hospitalizations nationwide at the highest level since mid-August. Here in Arizona, health officials reported 1,157 new cases today and 16 additional deaths. That brings the state's totals to over 240,000 COVID-19 infections and nearly 5,900 fatalities.
We have grossly mishandled the pandemic, and the fact that it's taken off again just reminds us how we're not learning from our mistakes. And we could have avoided this by doing the right thing, but we don't seem to learn.
And on the therapeutics front, Eli Lilly is discontinuing its antibody drug trial on hospitalized patients after finding the drug is not effective on severe coronavirus cases. The trial is continuing for patients with milder cases.
Prominent Republicans are flocking to the Valley today to hold multiple events in support of the re-election of President Donald Trump. This comes just a day before the president himself makes 2 appearances in Arizona. In Tempe, Senators Mike Lee from Utah, Rand Paul from Kentucky, and Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida participated in a Liberty for Trump event this afternoon. Then Lee, Paul, and Gaetz were joined by Arizona Congressman Andy Biggs to host a Latter-day Saints for Trump event in Gilbert. Currently, Lee, Paul, and Gaetz are joining Arizona Congressman Paul Gosar in Apache Junction for another Liberty for Trump event that is going on now. And finally, later tonight, Lee and Senator Martha McSally will meet with the Chandler GOP.
Political ad spending is smashing records in Phoenix this election season. Cronkite News politics reporter Alex Gall dug into where the cash is coming from and why it matters for the future of Arizona politics.
If you live in Arizona, it's been hard to escape these.
It's time for Washington to solve problems, not create more of them.
And these.
The most important election of a lifetime.
Political ads have been all over the airwaves in Phoenix in the run-up to the 2020 elections. But it wasn't always that way.
As a 4th-generation Arizonan, we used to not get one presidential ad in this state, not one on television, nothing, zero. That started changing about 10 years ago.
Phoenix has seen a sharp uptick in political spending, starting with Barack Obama's first presidential bid in 2008. But even experts couldn't predict the record spending in 2020, even far down the ticket.
The advertising is getting a lot deeper, meaning that it's not just these big races. We saw a lot of advertising from different congressional districts. It's amazing at how important every seat is right now.
Rich Barone is the vice president at Cox Media, which serves over 1 million homes in the Phoenix market. Barone attributes the record spending levels to a changing Arizona electorate that's turning the traditionally red state purple.
I think what you're seeing is the Democratic Party senses a weakening in Arizona and is just going nonstop to try and flip it Democratic.
An analysis done by data firm Advertising Analytics ranked Phoenix the #1 individual political ad market in the country, edging out other battlegrounds like Pittsburgh, Orlando, and Detroit.
The most important part of Arizona from an electoral perspective, Maricopa County, is all within the Phoenix DMA. So you can really put all of your money into this one market instead of kind of diluting it across 6 or 7 markets like some of these other big states.
Advertising Analytics' data shows a large spending gap between Republicans and Democrats in Arizona, with Democrats outspending Republicans by over $65 million across the state's top 4 races this year.
It's not necessarily normal for Arizona, but it is kind of the trend of this year that we've seen across the board, all the way from the top of the ticket down to local races, is that Democratic candidates in particular are really fundraising really well.
And while over 1 million Arizonans have already cast their ballots, it's safe to say you'll be seeing more ads like this now and for the foreseeable future.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
In Phoenix, Alex Goll, Cronkite News.
With Election Day exactly 1 week away, the Trump and Biden campaigns are making their final pushes. Meanwhile, early voting has hit record numbers, with more people casting ballots early than in all of 2016. And the youth voter turnout is also surging right now. Young voters are a crucial part of the electorate and are already making up a larger share of early voting across 14 key states compared to 2016. A new poll from Axios and SurveyMonkey shows young voters support Biden over Trump by vast numbers. According to their data, voters 18 to 34 are solidly leading towards Biden in 45 out of 50 states.
It's official. The White House held a swearing-in ceremony for Amy Coney Barrett last night, shortly after she was confirmed by the Senate. Justice Clarence Thomas swore her in under a constitutional oath. Barrett's nomination process was one of the quickest in modern times. At Monday's event, Barrett said she will do her job independent of both political branches and her own preferences.
Thank you, President Trump, for selecting me to serve as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. It's a privilege to be asked to serve my country in this office, and I stand here tonight truly honored and humbled. Thanks also to the Senate for giving its consent to my appointment. I am grateful for the confidence you have expressed in me, and I pledge to you and to the American people that I will discharge my duties to the very best of my ability.
Barrett is 48 years old and will likely serve on the court for decades. Her confirmation gives conservatives a 6-3 majority. Barrett heads to the court as the justice is ready to take on a number of issues, including the future of the Affordable Care Act, the president's taxes, abortion, and any potential disputes regarding the 2020 election.
Arizona had its highest unemployment rate back in April, sitting at 13.4%. Project Search is a program that teaches disabled young adults skills that will help them obtain a job in the competitive workforce. Faith Abercrombie discovered how this year's long effort has adapted their training during a global pandemic.
Project Search works with young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
My experiences in person would be good experiences because you get to learn opportunities like learning how to keep a job, and learning how to do things, and learning how to be successful.
The end goal? To get a job.
The end goal of Project Search is a competitive employment in their community. So once they're completed the 9-month program, we then help them figure out where they're going to work.
Interns at Project Search are constantly learning new workplace skills that are changing because of COVID-19, anywhere from wearing the proper PPE to using the correct cleaning techniques.
When you are introducing yourself for the first time to people, you always want to shake your hand. The wearing of the mask and, being more cautious of how people are, even with spacing. People kind of don't have space boundaries sometimes, and so we are able to teach them more about the things that employers are looking for and how they can stand out in a positive way.
Tasks like folding towels, vacuuming, and rolling silverware are some of the few rotations they still have available since the pandemic.
Because of COVID, the lack of business at the hotel is making us only right now come 2 days a week versus the 5. And we're limited on the rotations. I normally have 12 rotations, and right now we have about 3 to 4, so it's limiting us.
Even with limitations, the interns are motivated to avoid the latest September unemployment rate in Arizona, 6.7%.
You're learning to not get fired and learning how to be on time for work. And it gets us to get a job in the real world. I'm hoping to be a barista, hopefully.
Faith Abercrombie, Cronkite News.
Project Search interns are expected to graduate the program May of 2021. Until further guidelines, they will continue the program in a hybrid format.
Finally tonight, for the first time ever, NASA is confirming there is water below the surface of the moon that's exposed to the sun. The agency announced the discovery yesterday, saying it was made using its SOFIA telescope. It observed the moon in mid-flight from a modified Boeing 747 jet. But the amount of water is just a fraction of what you would find in the Sahara Desert.
In a separate study, NASA said there could be more water than previously believed in tiny lunar ice patches that are permanently protected from the sun. That discovery was made using NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which circles the moon. Scientists say water could be a crucial resource in future moon missions, including NASA's Artemis program, which is currently set to return Americans to the moon by 2024.
That's it for Cronkite News tonight. Thank you for joining us.
And for top Arizona stories anytime, go to cronkitenews.acpbs.org.
Next on Break It Down, why white and black women have difficulties being allies.
So, Rebecca, why do you think that white women and black women have a hard time being friends and allies?
Well, Eleanor, I think there's a couple reasons. And the first one that comes to mind is, growing up, we're not in a lot of the same spaces. If you think about schools and segregation, we don't share a lot of the same schools. If you think about even in more diverse schools, there's things like tracking that put white kids and black kids in different classrooms and on different academic programs. Then you think about where we socialize in our neighborhoods and in our communities. We don't share the same spaces very often in the context of structural racism. And so I think that's one barrier to white and black women being friends. When I think about it too, when I think about making friendships with black women, it seems like the more I know about racism and structural racism, the harder that ask is, right? So I have a lot of friends who say, oh, I want to be friends with black women. I want to know more black women. And I think, man, that seems like kind of a big ask when you think about all of the harm that has been done by white women to black women and how in trying to become a friend to a black woman, you're asking that person to overlook those harms. When you think about how often white women co-sign with racism, it just seems like a really big ask. Like, could you get over that, please, so we can be friends?
I want to come back to what you said about white women co-signing with racism. But I think you're right with the structural racism. And we know from the research that white people live the most racially segregated lives. They are more likely to live in predominantly white neighborhoods, send their kids to predominantly white schools. If they have a religious organization, those are more likely to be predominantly white. They're least likely to have non-white friends. So there is something to be said for the fact that white people are the most racially segregated, and that inhibits sort of the contact I also think you raise a good point with the harm. And we know historically that white women have used their race and gender to weaponize institutions against non-white individuals. You know, we could think about Emmett Till. Historically, a white woman lied and allowed her brother and father-in-law to brutally murder Emmett Till. We could even go back as recently as May with Amy Cooper, who tried to weaponize the police against Chris Cooper, the African-American male bird watcher. And just in the past couple of years, you know, we see all the memes on social media for white women calling the police on Black people just doing the most random things, Barbecue Becky and Permit Patty. And so I do think that intentional desire to weaponize institutions against non-whites is real. I also think that there is unintentional harm, given that a lot of white women either minimize racism or try to deny its existence. Racism structures every aspect of my life every day. And I don't want to be friends with someone who denies that fact. You're denying my livelihood. I will say, Rebecca, you are my first white female friend. And I think the only reason that we're friends is because you don't engage in harm and you are willing to have what I would imagine sometimes might be tough conversations about whiteness and white supremacy. And so I've never felt unsafe in your presence, but I don't think that you are the norm, unfortunately.
Can we break that down for some white women who might not quite see? I think white women can wrap their heads around like, oh yeah, I'm not gonna like weaponize the police, like the sort of larger incidents. I think white women are starting to be able to wrap their heads around that. But the idea that I might not minimize your experience as a Black woman, I think that might be a little harder for white women to think about. And so I think we should break that down. Like, say you come to me and you have an experience at work that you feel like you've been treated differently as a Black woman, and we have the same job. So we're in a convenient spot to be able to share the same job. Right. And I know what your job in general is like. Right. I don't know what it's like to be a Black woman in your job, but I know the basic parameters. And you come to me and you tell me about an experience you have as a Black woman. And one way that I think white women very frequently minimize that is to say, you know, Eleanor, I've had that same experience as a woman. So it's not because you're a Black woman. In fact, I've had the same experience. And I think that's a way, like, how are we supposed to have an authentic friendship when I'm telling you, oh no, your experience isn't because you're a Black woman, it's because you're a woman and we actually share that. When in fact, we don't share the same experience as a woman in our same jobs.
And that's the minimization, right? You're attempting to deny my experiences, which are rooted in the intersection of race and gender and possibly class as well, and reduce them down to gender. I want to go back to what you said, that white women minimize the sexism and align with the racism, or minimize the misogyny and the sexism and align with the racism. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I've given that a lot of thought recently. And I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I have some ideas. I think that one of the main driving forces, whether we're, as white women, we're cognizant of this or not, is that a lot of us, like cisgender white women in heterosexual relationships, we are indirectly benefiting from racism. So I'm married to a white man. When he gets promoted instead of a person of color, I get something from that. When he gets put on increasingly higher aspects of his jobs, either through formal or informal promotions and pay raises and those kinds of things, I'm benefiting from that. That's coming home to me. And I have to think that collectively, we're sort of, whether we're making this consciously or not, we're sort of making this bargain like, well, it's really hard to say, I don't want to benefit from those things and to reject those benefits. And so I think we sort of put ourselves as sort of second tier and say, okay, I'm going to accept this misogyny. I'm going to endorse it. I'm going to say it's okay, but I'm going to still pull from this other side of the equation relative to the financial gains that I get through being married to a white man who gets promoted, the social gains, whatever those are that I get, the access to resources and schools and whatever are all those both economically tangible and intangible benefits I get for co-signing and aligning with racism, even if I'm sort of ignoring the gendered aspects of my own experience and dismissing the misogyny, I'm still pulling from this other side of the equation with regularity and with a benefit that we must collectively be deciding is worth it.
Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us, breaking down the difficulties between Black women and white women.
Thanks, Eleanor.
This hour of local news is made possible by contributions from the Friends of PBS, members of your PBS station. Thank you. If you have comments about Arizona PBS News, please contact us at one of the addresses on your screen. Thank you. Support for Arizona PBS comes from viewers like you and from
The Persian Room. Travel to another world, to a land of exotic aromas and period decor for a fine dining experience. The Persian Room in North Scottsdale on Scottsdale Road, 1 light north of Frank Lloyd Wright Boulevard. Gourmet exotic cuisine at its best.
There's so much more to be done in making the world a more even playing field.
We're not done reporting. We're not done fighting for equity.
We are not done.